Hi guys, video 4 for year 2. The very first thing that happens before Jesus enters into his public ministry is he gets baptized and he enters into the desert. Now, just like the videos last year, we really focused on typology. Typology is when you see the New Testament hidden in the Old Testament, and you see the Old Testament fulfilled in the New Testament. The Old Testament is everything that happened before Jesus. So the Old Testament is basically this dysfunctional love story where God is reaching for people and people are responding to God, but ultimately people screw up. Then when we get to the New Testament, Jesus takes on those roles that people had initially tried to take on and failed, except he does them successfully. We're going to see part of that playing out here. If you remember, whenever we talked about Moses, when the Israelites were finally freed from slavery, they had to cross the Red Sea. They crossed the Red Sea, entered into the desert for 40 years. Here, before Jesus begins his ministry, he is going to enter into the Jordan River for his baptism and then go off into the desert. Not only does Jesus do this, but he gives us the perfection of those events, okay? The baptism and the passing into the desert. So we're going to explore those a bit. We need to tackle this before we fully tackle the other things that Jesus did in his ministry. I say fully. There's no possible way that I could fully tackle this with you in, a remaining 10 videos or 11 videos after this. But anyway, we're going to dive into it. So let's start with the baptism of Jesus. Why did God get baptized? That's confusing, right? Very confusing. One of the beautiful things that happens, though, with Jesus becoming incarnate, which incarnate means that God became flesh, became man, okay? One of the beautiful things that happened when God became man is he gathered humanity up into his divinity. It's this incorporation of humans into the divine. One big thing, though, if you were following me, let's say, and I told you, I want you to do blank, but you never once saw me do it, should you trust me? Probably not. So if Jesus is giving us all of these things to do, like love your neighbor, but he never once showed love to somebody else, or get baptized, and he never got baptized himself, would there be an encouragement to do what he's telling us to do? It's kind of like that awful saying, do as I say, not as I do. I've heard people say that. I hate that saying. It's stupid. Don't say that. But Jesus shows us every single sacrament by acting it out, okay? And that's one of the things we see here. The Jews already participated in ritualistic bathing. So they were already bathing for the forgiveness of sins. Jesus, though, his baptism is something different, okay? So first off, God is man. Then God enters into the Jordan River. The Jordan River, what people need to kind of see, it's on a lower elevation. Basically, everything washed into this river. The river is nasty. If you Google pictures of the Jordan River, it's like dirt water. It smells horrible. Everything, I'll let you use your imagination, is in that water. But what we see here when Jesus immerses himself into this water is Jesus immersing himself into the messiness of our humanity, okay? So he goes into this river, he gets baptized, but his baptism is different. While others are doing this baptism for forgiveness of sins, which we do that, we do believe that the original sin of Adam and Eve is kind of washed away, but he does it and something else happens. When he gets baptized, God marks him and says, "This is my son whom I am well pleased." That's the other thing about baptism for us. You are marking yourself as a child of God. You're putting essentially an invisible mark on your soul, something you can't see, by entering into the waters of baptism. It symbolizes a death and a rising as a new creation. And we'll cover the sacraments a little bit later. But Jesus enters into this disgusting water, which again, he is sanctifying this water. Just like humanity, we couldn't save ourselves. Jesus, however, enters into humanity and he is able to save us by his sacrifice. And this is often a very confusing topic. Like, I get asked all the time by teenagers, why would God sacrifice himself to himself? Okay, God didn't have to do that. All right, he didn't have to. However, he chose a Jewish setting for his public revelation. Public revelation means just to basically give us the information that we need to understand how salvation works. He chose a Jewish setting to do that. And in this Jewish setting, he adopted these Jewish rituals and used those to lead us to a path of salvation. That might sound a little bit confusing, but essentially what it means is Jesus is utilizing the sacrificial nature of the Jewish religion. And through that, he saves us. We covered this in the last year's video. We're going to talk about it a little bit more as we talk about the Eucharist this year. But God is fully entering into our humanity. And in our humanity, we go through certain things that Jesus fully enters into and perfects. So again, he's going into the disgustingness of this river, sanctifying that water, and basically sanctifying humanity and joining people to God as children of God. We're marking ourselves. So hopefully that makes sense with the way I explained it. So in Jesus's baptism, we begin to understand, if I do this, I am marking myself for God. Now, the Jordan River, again, was very significant to the Jews. And this story, if they were reading this story or listening to the story about what Jesus did of him entering into the water and then going into the desert, they realize a perfection is happening here, a perfection of leaving slavery in Egypt and entering into the desert for 40 years. When the Israelites entered into the desert for 40 years, when they were freed from slavery as Egyptians, or from Egypt, they were freed from slavery in Egypt. They entered into the desert for 40 years. The reason that they did that, we know that the word midbar, that is actually in the original translation, we translate it to desert, but what that means is it's a place to become rejuvenated, to rest and become rehabilitated. So the Israelites entered into the desert. When they did that, though, they complained, they started to worship false idols, they rebelled, they basically cried out and were like, I want to be a slave again because this is hard. I don't like, being rehabilitated, basically. They complained a lot. However, what we see happen here is Jesus is going to pass into the desert and he perfects it. So when Jesus goes into the desert, he goes in the desert to fast and pray for 40 days. Again, 40 days, 40 years, there's connection here, and he gets tempted by the devil. When we say that Jesus fully entered into humanity, he experiences every single thing people experience. Okay, I will say that again. When Jesus entered into humanity, he experiences what we experience, okay? He's gathering humanity up into his divinity. So in the desert, the devil tempts him 3 times. And these temptations, they can, if you feel like you just want to say surface level and take them point blank literal, okay? But we need to go a little bit deeper with them. The very first temptation of the devil is he tells Jesus, why don't you turn those stones into bread because you haven't eaten and you have to be hungry? And Jesus rejects it. He perfectly rejects the temptation. Okay, that sounds a little silly at first. Like, is it, if you're hungry and you eat, is that a sin? No. So what's happening here? Jesus is tackling every single earthly sin that we read about in the Old Testament that people failed, okay? So what we are seeing here is Jesus isn't necessarily rejecting eating, okay? And he's also not rejecting the fact that he has divine power. What he is rejecting, though, is earthly pleasures, giving way to earthly pleasures. Every single person, every single decision we make, from the type of cereal you pick out to the type of clothing you're going to wear, it's all geared towards happiness. All of us do it. However, if we gear all of our happiness toward earthly things, we're basically abusing creation, okay? If your happiness comes from eating, it's disordered. If your happiness comes from alcohol, if it comes from sex, if it comes from, whatever. If your happiness comes from earthly things, it's a disordered relationship with earthly things. That's what we're seeing going on here. Jesus is being tempted by the devil to focus on earthly things, and he rejects it. Okay, so this would be, this is something that we need to focus on. Jesus rejected this temptation, and we need to work towards rejecting it also. One thing to note, the devil uses scripture to try to trip up Jesus. This is also very important. The Bible can be used to justify any sort of evil you want if you approach it improperly. Okay, I love the way that Origen, an early church father, how he teaches us to read the Bible. What he says is read the Bible through Christ lenses. Basically, he says, put on Jesus glasses. If you're reading anything in Scripture and it is telling you to exclude others, to hurt people, anything that Christ would not have been in support of, you cannot read it literally then. You have to go to an allegorical reading of it, which means you have to find some deeper meaning in it. Because yes, there's violence in the Bible. There's all sorts of things in the Bible. So we have to protect how we read that. And that's one of the reasons that we turn towards the church, or turn to the church for an interpretation, because I will tell you what, reading scripture is very difficult. So the second temptation that Jesus undergoes is basically a rejection of fame. What is that, the second one? Yeah, I believe the second temptation, I might be completely out of order. So this could either be the second or the third. But I believe the second temptation is the devil tells Jesus, throw yourself off of the temple, or maybe it's the synagogue. Anyway, throw yourself off of a high point in the city and, let everybody see the angels save you. Okay, so Jesus performs miracles when he enters into his public ministry. He performs miracles, people see him do it, and that is one of the reasons that they're drawn to him. However, if you saw a man throw himself off of a really high building and angels save him from death, that is probably immediately that spectacle that takes place, that's probably immediately going to draw you to wanting to follow him. So let me ask this then. If Jesus had said, yes, I'm going to do that, I'm going to basically use fame and popularity to gain people for God, would that cause you to have a true and authentic relationship with God? I know it wouldn't me. I would be following somebody because of the amazing thing that I saw. I would not be trying to form a loving bond, a loving relationship with God. It would all be based on this spectacle. However, Jesus rejects fame. There is nothing about Jesus that is attention seeking and wanting popularity, but that's a trap that people fall into. We want to compete with others, and we want to be the best. We want people to choose us over other people. And a lot of times it's because of a spectacle. We don't rely on loving people. We don't rely on being just a good person to draw others to us, which we should. We tend to seek out these shows in order to gain popularity, but Jesus rejects that. And I believe I might have mixed up the 2 and 3, but anyway, it's fine. The third temptation that Jesus rejects is the devil says, if you worship me, I will give you everything that you see. All of creation will be yours if you just worship me. Now, again, where is your happiness coming from? Do you have a disordered relationship with creation? Because ultimately, if you continue to turn outward for your happiness, for to make your life valuable, instead of turning inward and turning to God, you're going to come up short. Okay? There is no possible amount of consumption of things in creation that can make you transcend, that can bring you to this transcendent level of bonding with God. Here, Jesus rejects that. He knows that true happiness is not in the consumption of earthly things. It is not in greed. It is not in the pride of having all of the nice things around you. It is in that relationship with God where you're going to transcend and have that true deep happiness. So hopefully, these two, the baptism and kind of explaining this temptation of Jesus and the devil, Jesus in the desert, help you understand the relationship further that the Old Testament and the New Testament have with each other. Additionally, hopefully, it helps you understand what Jesus is setting up, okay? Jesus is telling you, your happiness is not going to come from creation itself. This earth, this life that you have on earth is coming and going. It's passing away, okay? You have to find your connection with God. The path to finding that connection with God is loving God above everything else and loving your neighbor as yourself. So remember, that means you have to love yourself too. But, here's our roadmap, okay? So next, I don't even know what my next lesson is. We're going to start talking about things that Jesus did in his ministry, teachings that he did, because, ultimately the teachings of Jesus is why we're Christian. So for your writing prompt, I want you to write down your relationship that you have with those 3 temptations that Jesus went through. So explain, is there a focus that you have on earthly things that distract your focus from more important things like your relationship with God? So write a little bit on that. Looking forward to reading it, and I hope that you enjoyed this video. Bye.